Hinesville Chapter 15. Vivian had called Cooper and he readily agreed to her plan. They decided she would come pick him up at his house and then they would all meet up at Nate's. Ben went in early as promised and was there waiting when Sullivan arrived. Sullivan readily agreed and gave them the week, but their time on the case was finished at week's end. What couldn't be found out this week they would have to find out another time. Ben thanked him and immediately started making calls to prepare the others. Ben grabbed all of the equipment they would need and left to meet Mason in the unit. "Nate will be here in a few," Mason reported as he helped Ben load up all of the items he brought out of the station. The two hopped in the unit, waiting on the other two team members. "I talked to Vivian and she apologized to me for jumping in our shit," Mason mentioned and turned to Ben. "Are you serious?" Ben shook his head as Mason nodded. "She has nothing to apologize for." "That's what I told her," Mason sighed and looked over at Ben. "She still feels bad about it though. Poor Viv, she is one of the nicest people I know and she's had to put up with so much shit in her life." Ben was disgusted with these bastards and wanted to hunt them down and beat the shit out of them. They both turned to see Lane pulling into the vacant parking lot. He quickly parked his unit a couple of slots over and jumped out. "Lane," Ben looked in his rearview mirror, "you made it early." "I'm in the process of moving to Richmond Hill," Lane reminded the two as he moved his gear to the middle of the seat. "That's right." Ben remembered he wanted to be closer to Vivian, and Nate will be moving in on Saturday. "Now Ben, I know you and Sherry don't want to uproot the kids, but what about you, Mason?" Lane questioned him, knowing he had requested it, but didn't make it a requirement. "We're looking for a house." Mason turned to look at Lane. "My wife is really excited, she's going to be so much closer to her parents, but we're probably going to rent. We can't seem to find a house we like and we're not sure we want to stay there, so we're going to rent out our house in Hinesville and rent an alternate house in Richmond Hill. I like the sound of that, and after everything is done and we have her yes or no, we can all go back to Hinesville," Lane interjected as he looked to see Nate pulling in. "Look, it's Nate," Lane nodded in the direction of the driveway. Nate pulled into the parking lot and quickly exited his unit to climb in the back of Ben's. "I thought I would be getting here early." Nate closed his door and Ben began to back out of the parking slot. Vivian and Cooper waited at Nate's house wondering where the crew was. "We still have to pick up our rental," Cooper commented as he looked at his watch. "I don't know what's taking them so long." Vivian paced in Nate's driveway, her gun tucked safely under her t-shirt. Ben and Mason then pulled the unit into the driveway. "The others are right behind us in the rentals," Mason said and walked to the back of the unit. "We need to transfer the equipment and then we'll be ready to go." Ben looked over at the two as he got out of the driver's side of the unit. Just then Lane and Nate pulled up in two rented SUVs. Lane pulled his into the driveway and Nate parked his blocking the end of the driveway. Nate grabbed something from Ben and Lane began to help Mason transfer the great majority of the equipment to the other SUV. Lane set up a laptop in the back seat of the SUV Ben was driving and began to surround the area with other equipment. "Mason is going to ride in the back of your unit, Ben is going to drive the other, and I'm going to be with Ben and monitor you guys on the computer using GPS, your phones and the GPS on the cars themselves," Lane informed the two. "We were going to rent our SUV." Vivian looked over at Ben and Nate who were standing on the lawn discussing what they wanted to do. "No," Ben smiled and shook his head as him and Nate finished the conversation. "It's a case, the Bureau is paying for it." Cooper and Vivian smiled and climbed in their vehicle. Nate made himself at home in the driver's seat of their SUV, setting up all the equipment he needed for the drive. "We will be Unit 1 from this point on," Nate looked up as he continued setting up equipment. Vivian put a couple of packs in the back seat with her and sat to wait on the others. Cooper stood in the door of the front passenger seat, not remembering her ever being this nervous. He watched as she calmly stepped back out of the SUV, walked over to a storm drain near the curb and began to throw up. Cooper silently walked over to her with a bottle of water. All of the others stopped what they were doing and started to walk over. Cooper held his hand up, waving them off. Lane ignored it, and he waited until she was walking back to the unit before he continued. The others went back to what they were doing but kept an eye on Vivian. Mason also ignored the motion from Cooper and stepped over to Vivian. "Viv, we can wait. Do you want more time?" She finished and shook her head. Cooper handed her the bottle. She took it and swished some water in her mouth for a minute and spit it out. "You okay to do this?" Cooper questioned her gently. "Yeah." Vivian looked up at him and over to Mason. "I'm just nervous." "Are you sure?" Mason wanted that absolute confirmation. Vivian thought for a moment and shook her head. "I don't know." Cooper sighed and shook his head. "I'm torn about it too. Should we be doing this?" Vivian took a sip of the water. "We could always wait until later in the week," Cooper looked over at her, almost seeming to not want to do it. Vivian sighed, thinking long and hard, looked over at Cooper. No, we need to do this today. His attempt to get between her and the other guys had not gone unnoticed by her either. She was now more determined to do it, knowing he was averse to it. He didn't have to do it if he didn't want to, but now she knew she did. Cooper nodded and the three walked over to the rental. I need to do this, Vivian sighed, and Cooper nodded in agreement. They sat back down in the unit and Vivian grabbed some mints out of one of her bags. Cooper stood in her open door and rubbed her back as she leaned over, collecting herself. Mason went to the open door on the other side of the rental. She sat back up and looked over at Mason. I didn't think ever that I'd be this nervous. We can wait if you want, Cooper offered as he continued standing in the open door next to her. No, she shook her head. I want to do this. Everyone finished their assigned tasks and they started on their way to Statesboro. Nate glanced over at Vivian in the rearview mirror as they got on the road. Viv, if you want to wait, it's fine, we don't mind. No, I need to do this, Vivian returned the gaze in the mirror. I just didn't think it would weigh on me this much. The group finally made it to Statesboro and Nate quickly located the intersection where they were taken. It was an out-of-the-way intersection on a quiet street. A major portion of the area was old warehouses, mostly unused. Vivian got out of the SUV and stood in the intersection. Ben had pulled their SUV into one of the parking lots. She turned to Nate. Please bear with me, I'm going to try and get you in the same positioning they were in. You got it, Viv. Nate climbed back into the driver's seat. He rolled down all the windows so he could hear her directions. She began directing him and they soon found the positioning of the abductor's vehicle. Vivian climbed into the back seat of Unit 1. She looked over at Cooper, who was standing at an open door to her left, and held out her hand. Give it to me. He reached in his pocket and pulled out a blindfold. She took a couple of deep breaths and put it on. Everyone got into their respective units and readied themselves for the trip. Nate rolled up all the windows and waited for Vivian to give him directions. Mason sat behind her in the third row of seats, and Cooper took the front passenger seat. Take a hard right, Vivian began. Go about 35 miles per hour. She continued to give him the directions, going so far as to tell them when they would approach a curve in the road. But turn by turn she gave him every direction, making loops that snaked through the city, obviously meant to confuse her. Take a left here, Vivian directed Nate as they continued on their journey. She could feel their vehicle take the left. You'll soon take a right. Okay, Nate sighed and she could feel him making a U-turn. This is where we need to go somewhere and regroup. Mark our location, Cooper spoke into the mic of his headset, talking to Lane, and stand by. What is it? Vivian questioned and reached up and removed the blindfold. We're close. That's what I figured, and we're in a very bad location now. Nate knew they shouldn't go any further without some sort of backup. She looked around to see they were in a very remote, wooded area. Cooper, after speaking with Lane, turned to Nate. Let's head about 15 minutes up the road and regroup in Allendale. Where are we? Vivian looked up front at the men. Just inside South Carolina, near Allendale. Nate started on the way to Allendale. I'm going to stop for fuel when we get to town, besides I think we all need a break. They arrived at the gas station, which was fairly busy. Ben pulled Unit 2 up to the pumps also and began to fuel their unit as well. Mason pulled Vivian aside. Are you okay? The concern Mason felt for his oldest friend was evident on his face. Vivian tossed her head and saw Cooper walking over. She waved him off and turned back to Mason. I'll be all right. Mason pulled Vivian away from the group. That's not an answer. He looked at her as the others went in to pay for the fuel. Are you okay? Vivian thought for a moment, wondering how to explain what she was feeling to Mason. I'm better than I thought I would be, and just to let you know, I see Dr. Hardy on Wednesday. Mason put his hands in his pockets. If you need anything, and I mean that, you better call me or Kelly, any of the guys. You know we would be there for you anytime you needed it. Mason could see the tension in her. Hell, you and Lane go back to your rookie days, Viv, and you know any one of us would lay down in front of a bus if we thought it would help you. I know, Maze. Vivian sighed and turned away to wipe a tear off. It's just I don't want to be a pain in the ass. Look at me, Mason demanded her attention, and she turned to look at him. The pain on her face broke Mason's heart. That will never happen. He stepped over and hugged her. It will never happen. Mason continued talking to her until she calmed down, and the two returned to the group. I'm going to go get something to drink, Vivian announced and stepped toward the service station. I'll come with you, Cooper grinned, thinking of food. I'm getting hungry and gas station fodder is actually sounding appetizing. Vivian laughed and the two walked into the store to get some food and drink. Lane motioned for Mason to join them at the pump. What was that all about? Mason shook his head. She's hurting, guys, she's hurting bad. What did she tell you? Ben now shared Mason's concerns as well as the rest of the group. Nate was keeping an eye on the station, making sure the two didn't walk out unnoticed. I could see that the other day in South Carolina. Lane looked over the group. But here's what I don't get, Cooper seems to be taking this in stride, but Viv is taking it hell like I did in Iraq. Lane glanced around. It's a grueling place to be. It's a good thing Viv didn't want to date right now. I don't think they should be right now. Nate turned to the group and then back to the station. I was thinking the same thing. Ben looked over at Nate to make sure they weren't coming. I've noticed he's been trying to come between us and her. I've seen him do that a couple of times myself. Lane looked over the group. We might want to consider keeping him away from her to a point. But how are we going to do that? Mason questioned. They're partners. But if you remember, Ben began glancing around a bit, when we started in Midway they said we work with a team now. We could work with anyone on the team, but the pairing is very loosely done. Lane nodded and thought about what had been said. We'll have to start splitting them up a bit. The rest of the men nodded in agreement. We, on another note, need to make sure she goes to Dr. Hardy though, Nate mentioned and turned back to the station. She has an appointment on Wednesday. Mason looked over at Lane knowing he had an in with Dr. Hardy. Can you talk to him? I'll do that. Lane nodded, making a mental note to call Dr. Hardy as soon as he could. But let's get back to today. Nate turned to Mason as Ben and Lane listened in. How in the hell did she do that? Mason sighed. I don't know this for sure, but I have suspected since we were like 7 or 8 that she has a great memory. Photographic? I mean, I knew she had a good memory, but damn, I didn't know it was that good. Lane was shocked, and though he knew she was smart as a whip, he never suspected her memory was that sharp. If not, it's pretty close to it. Mason looked out at the other three, surprised they had never picked up on it. Why didn't you tell us this before? Ben seemed a bit put off by it. First of all, I didn't know for sure, and second, I thought it was pretty obvious. Mason raised his eyebrows. How was it obvious? Nate turned to Mason as they all waited for an answer. Have you paid attention when she works a case? Mason looked at them, shocked they were even having this conversation. Come on, Lane, you worked with her for 4 years, you had to notice how she works a case. She looks at everything once. Sure, Nate was a little confused. You haven't noticed how she remembers every detail? Mason looked at the men, searching for some sort of recognition. Mason could finally see the men now putting 2 and 2 together. But she didn't do exceptional in school, she was slightly above average, but nothing made her particularly stand out, Ben pointed out, remembering when she was vetted. Exactly, Mason was trying to drive the point home. She, I suspect, did that intentionally. She didn't want to stand out, and she is most definitely smart enough to know how to adjust her performance to suit her needs, at least on a test. Do you know her IQ? Nate looked over at Mason and glanced back at the station. She's never taken a test as far as I know. Mason turned to see where Vivian and Cooper were, and I know her well enough to recognize she would throw it. Lane sighed, so chances are her score is through the roof. Nate looked at Mason. Do you think Cooper could or would do the same thing? Mason looked at Nate, pondering the question. All we can do is ask, but I'm not sure many people could do what Vivian just did. Let's move this to the corner of the parking lot, Lane suggested, noting they had finished fueling the 2 vehicles. We are blocking the pumps and we don't want to draw attention to ourselves. The men quickly moved the SUVs and the conversation to the edge of the large parking lot, near a wooden privacy fence. We can't tell this to anyone, Ben warned the group. If this is who we think it is, they will find out and we'll never see either of them again. It would be a join or die situation, Lane agreed, glancing to see if the 2 were walking up. And if I know the stubbornness of those 2? Mason didn't complete the thought, but they all knew what he was getting at. I'm officially telling all of you not to put any of this information into a report, Lane ordered the group. All of the men understood it was now a direct order. Mason looked past Nate to see the 2 walking up with trays of food. Food? I thought y'all might be hungry, Vivian set her trays down on the hood of the rental Ben was driving. It's just a snack, but it'll tide us over until we can get somewhere better. Thanks, Viv, Nate told her, looking at the snacks. I'm famished. The group feasted on the not-so-good-for-you food that was just as delicious as it was bad for them.